This year marks the 75th anniversary of the World War II D-Day invasion of Normandy, France. Next, retired Admiral James Stavridis and Tweed Roosevelt, great-grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, discuss the events of Operations Neptune and Overlord, the sea and land components of D-Day. Tweed Roosevelt's uncle, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., was part of the first wave on June the 6th at Utah Beach, while his cousin Quentin Roosevelt II was part of the force that attacked Omaha Beach. The National Defense University Foundation and the National War College Alumni Association hosted this event.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Bill Parker, the President and CEO of the National Defense University Foundation, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here tonight. I'd like to thank the National War College Foundation as well for co-hosting this with us this evening. Before we begin our program and introduce our two esteemed panelists this evening, I'd like to mention a couple other distinguished people that we have here in the audience with us. Admiral Carl Schultz, U.S. Coast Guard Commandant, sir, very good to have you here this evening. Lieutenant General Jeffrey Rockwell, the Army's Judge Advocate General. General, good to have you here. General Irwin Lewis, the Commandant of the Joint Forces Staff College, good to have you here, sir. General Kyle Robinson, the Air Force Commandant of the Dwight D. Eisenhower School. Brigadier General Jack Polici, the NDUF Foundation Chair. Rear Admiral Larry Jackson, the Director for Center of Joint and Strategic Logistics. Rear Admiral Michael Brown is with us this evening. Brigadier General Chad Mansky, Air Force and Commandant of the National War College. Miss Susan Eisenhower, and we can't forget Miss Priscilla Roberts, and of course Ambassador Walter Statler. And I'm sure there's many of you that I have not mentioned tonight, but it's a pleasure to have you all here with us. As you know, the National Defense University is the world's premier institute for studies in national defense and international security strategy and leadership. At the National Defense University Foundation, we are laser focused on two things: ensuring that we train and educate our national security leaders to prevent conflict when possible and win decisively when necessary. Tonight's event is an example of the programming offered by the Foundation in bringing together the nation's foremost thought leaders in national security, addressing the most complex issues facing our nation today. Next Thursday, June 6th, will mark 75 years since 156,000 Americans, British, and Canadian forces landed on a 50-mile stretch of beaches along the heavily fortified coast of France's Normandy coast. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history, with 6,939 ships. Think about that. We have 289 today in our Navy, 6,939 ships and landing vessels, 2,395 aircraft, and 867 gliders on that particular day. The planning of the D-Day invasion took years, and tonight we are very pleased to be joined by Priscilla Roberts, widow of Major General Milner Roberts, who served as a glider infantry officer and landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944 during the Normandy invasion. Ms. Roberts, thank you very much for being here again. We are also grateful for Ms. Roberts for her support for the Foundation and for the donation of the artifacts on view here this evening, which many of you have already seen. By late August 1944, all of the northern France had been liberated, and by the following spring, the Allies had defeated the Germans. The Normandy landings have been called the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. At this time, let me introduce our distinguished panelists this evening. Admiral James Stavridis. Those of you who haven't been awake for the last 15 years don't know who he is, but I'll give you a quick summary of him anyway. Admiral Stavridis served as the 12th Dean of the Fletcher School in Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. As a retired four-star officer in the U.S. Navy, he led the NATO alliance and global operations from 2009 to 2013 as Supreme Allied Commander with responsibility for Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, Syria, piracy, and cybersecurity, a small undertaking. He also served as commander of the U.S. Southern Command with responsibility of all military operations in Latin America from 2006 to 2009. Admiral Stavridis has more than 50 medals, including 28 from foreign nations. Earlier in his military career, he commanded the top ship of the Atlantic Fleet, winning the Battenberg Cup, as well as the Squadron of Destroyers and the Carrier Strike Group, all in combat. In 2016, he was vetted for vice president by then Secretary Hillary Clinton and subsequently invited to Trump Tower to discuss a cabinet position in the Trump administration. Admiral Stavridis earned his PhD in international relations and his MA in law and diplomacy, both from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. It would shock you to know he was at the top of his class in all of those. Admiral Stavridis is the chair of the board of the U.S. Naval Institute, the chair of the board of counselors at McLarty Associates, a monthly columnist for Time Magazine, and chief international security analysis for NBC News, and operating executive for the Carlyle Group, focused on advising their executive team and on investments and professionals on geopolitical and national security issues. I could go on, but we don't have enough time to read the rest of his accomplishments.
Stop.
Dr. Tweed Roosevelt. Tweed Roosevelt is chairman of the Roosevelt China Investment Corporation and chairman, MUS, Roosevelt China Pacific Fund, LP. He is a member of one of the oldest and most respected families in the United States, one that has had a tradition of producing leading public figures, including 2 American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and his great-grandfather, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a cousin. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Roosevelt, representing the Roosevelt family, received the Medal of Honor, the United States government's highest military honor, on behalf of his great-grandfather, President Theodore Roosevelt. Bill Clinton presented the medal during a ceremony in the Roosevelt Room, which is next to the Oval Office, of course, in the White House. Mr. Roosevelt is the principal trustee of the Roosevelt Trust and extensive experience in directing the management of public and private portfolios. He is also the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. He has taught at Columbia University. He has taught at Harvard and other colleges around the country. He holds a BA from Harvard College, an MBA from Columbia University, and a doctorate in humane letters as well. So there you go. There's 2 very impressive panelists we have with us this evening. That said, we will sit down and have a conversation. At the end of that conversation, I will ask for any questions the audience may have. And if you please join me in welcoming our panelists. Admiral.
Sir.
As we sit here at the National War College and have many students present, we can learn from Operation Overlord, and specifically military strategy, operational planning, and resourcing. Can you give us a little bit of insight on what you learned while you were here and how that applies today?
I can. I'm a very proud 92 graduate of National War College. I sat in that seat right up there in the very top row. And I got to tell you, I slept through lectures better than this one is going to be. Let's think about Operation Overlord, and let's reflect on Susan Eisenhower's comments. There are 3, to me, kind of big takeaways from Overlord that I think really apply today. First is the value of strategic thinking, as in the Allies had a multiplicity of choices ahead of them, but the big flick, well, we tend to forget this, the big flick was opening a second front while Stalin was pressing from the east. This was really the big muscle movement. It was great to liberate Paris. These landings were crucial, but this was a strategic move to put Germany in a 2-front war. And I think that's important to kind of remember that, and remember that Overlord opened that strategic gateway, Bill. Second, I think, and you'll permit me this latitude as a naval officer, the ocean matters. The sea matters. It is the maritime that gives you that flexibility to operate, to choose, am I going to come here or there, to move forces. All of that falls out from command of the seas. And I think that's a crucial theme that we see again and again in world history. And Overlord was a maritime operation in terms of opening the gate. And really, we talk about Overlord, its Operation Neptune was the landing itself. And all of the heroics that came afterward are crucial. But without the sea, without Operation Neptune, we never would have had Overlord and the ability to drive at the heart of Germany. So the oceans matter. And third, and here I'll just reflect on the fact that I was privileged to be at the 50th anniversary of D-Day as a young ship commander. I was captain of USS Barry. I was very proud of that ship. At the time, a brand new Arleigh Burke destroyer. And my mission was sail from Norfolk, go to Portsmouth, be part of an international pass-in review on the evening of June 5th, 1994, in front of the Queen, Her Majesty, who's still with us. And after we passed in front, along with all the ships of all of the Allied nations, we then sailed across the channel that night, and at dawn, on the 6th of June, 1994, 50 years after, my ship had the honor of being the backdrop at Omaha Beach. I mention that in the context of the third thing to remember. And the third thing to remember is that unbroken chain of soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guardsmen, Commandant, who were so integral to that. And that unbroken chain goes back before D-Day and continues to this day. And whenever I think of this extraordinary operation, I think of the young men and some women, and in today's military, many men and women who are part of that chain that protects us. Those are the thoughts that I think come to my mind when I think of Overlord.
Dr. Roosevelt, you get to follow up on that.
Yeah.
Here's your question. The Roosevelt family has had a very strong tradition in the, not only in the military, but obviously serving as leaders. Can you talk through that history just a little bit?
Yep, sure. I first am honored to be here. Very intimidated. I think pretty much everybody in this audience knows more than I do, but at least I'm safe on the family. I learned a long time ago that if I say something that doesn't sound right and somebody challenges me, I just say, well, in the family we say this, and it usually wins that way. Speaking of the family, I just, on a personal note, it's interesting, I find when I meet people all the time, and of course they ask me about Roosevelt, and it became clear to me after a while that people thought that in our family we did nothing but talk about TR. Thanksgiving, at Christmas, you know, whatever. We never talked about TR. I hardly ever remember anybody talking about TR. We talked about the same thing every other family talks about. You know, is Aunt Mabel ever going to get married? You know, how many children is Joan going to have? I mean, she's already had 6, and things like that. And so it just doesn't happen. But in any case, I, by osmosis, have learned various things. You asked me to talk a little bit about our family's contribution. At the start, I'm kind of a little embarrassed by this because I don't want to sound like I'm bragging about our family. Our family, again, is no different than any other family. Every family in the country contributed to the landing at Normandy and all the rest of the things. So I just start out by saying I've been asked this question, so I'll answer it. But I don't want to sound like you know, we're somehow contributed. We were lucky enough to be in places where we could contribute a great deal, but like every other family, everybody counts. Anyway, the Roosevelts first came here in somewhere around 1640, and we have participated in every war this country has ever fought. We started out in the Indian Wars. There were Roosevelts in the Indian Wars. There were certainly Roosevelts in the Revolution. In fact, one cousin named Isaac Roosevelt was called Isaac the Patriot, and actually played quite a big role in that. And we had ordinary soldiers in that and everything else. Civil War, for example. There are a number of Roosevelts fought. Famously, TR's father did not. And there is a theory out there that TR was so bellicose because he was trying to make up for the fact that his father didn't fight. His father made a major contribution to that. The reason his father didn't join the fighting forces was because he was married to an unreconstructed Southerner. His wife was from Georgia, and he didn't want to be fighting her brothers who were fighting in the war and other things. So, but he didn't just sit out the war. He spent the war, he created this idea that, they called it the allotment program, this idea that the soldiers in the field, obviously the Union soldiers in the field, were paid and basically with cash on the field, and that tendency was to spend it, as soldiers have done, on things like gambling, women, booze, what have you. And many of these soldiers were married. Of course, in the Civil War, many of the soldiers were older, and so they had a tendency to spend all their money and not send any home. And he felt this was, something had to be done about it. So he created, along with others, the allotment program, which was basically a sign-up program where soldiers signed up to send a certain percentage of their salaries directly to their spouses, mothers, whatever. And he spent the entire war going around from frontline camp to frontline camp, signing people up. So I don't think TR, the son, he was also Theodore Roosevelt, TR, the son, it's very confusing. We have lots of Theodore Roosevelt, so try to keep them all straight is difficult. But in any case, but he played a very major role, and he did what he could. He did it all for nothing, too. So it was, I think, something to be proud of. If you go on next, you come to, of course, the Spanish-American War. Everybody knows about the charge up San Juan Hill. I'll say a word about that in a minute. But perhaps even more importantly, TR at the beginning of the war, some of you may not know, was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And and I'll have more to say about TR and his Navy relations, but he was principally responsible for getting the Navy ready for the war that he saw was coming. And the Army, I'm sorry to say, here we're in good group, but the Army was not nearly as well prepared, and which drove TR crazy. But he very carefully prepared for it in all kinds of ways, in very sort of minimal ways of making sure that food and whatever was located correctly, and then in major strategic ways, like ordering Admiral Dewey to, as soon as war was declared, to attack Manila and take over the Spanish troops, which he did. So he had, and this will be a little theme in some of the things to say, he had a very balanced approach between minutia and strategy, and he had the ability to work with both. We'll say more about that later. Then, let's see, we get to the Second World War, which is obviously the subject of what we're talking about now. And trying to think of what role TR played in the Second World War is an interesting sort of thought. I mean, we all know about FDR. He was, after all, Commander-in-Chief at the time, so we got that side covered. But actually, when you start thinking about TR and what he did in 1900 and the few years after that, that had a major effect on the war, I'll mention some as we go forward, but there are various things that made a big difference, one of which was just this whole approach that TR champions and sort of got into the blood of our military, of planning ahead, of thinking, of being prepared, and also to convince the citizenry that they needed to be prepared for this. And when you look at what he did in the First World War, of trying to prepare the American people for the eventual, what he thought was inevitable and correctly would be their involvement in the war, has followed along with many of our leadership, both in the military and outside of it, the importance of preparing yourselves and preparing the people for war. Of course, in the Second World War, another thing was his three sons. Let's go back to the First World War. In the First World War, TR contributed his 4 sons to the effort. They all fought. 3 of them, the 3 older, were in Big Red 1, the 1st Division, and the 4th, Quentin, was a flyboy who fought the Germans on the front lines and didn't last. Nobody lasted very long then. He lasted a few weeks and was killed. My grandfather, Archie, was wounded in the First World War. He was wounded in the left leg, left arm. It looked like he was going to die. He was on the operating table, and they didn't really think he was going to make it. So the French government got together quickly and found a croix de guerre somewhere and gave it to him on the operating table, hoping to get it to him before he died. They didn't know my grandfather. He was a tough old guy, and he wasn't going to die on the operating table, and he made it out. So he survived. His 2 brothers also survived the war, so 3 of the 4 made it through. The Second World War, whole different story, of course. Now, as I said, FDR was commander-in-chief. There's been a lot written about him. I'm not going to talk about that so much because if you want to, you can read about it. But I thought I might tell you some of sort of the other side of the story. Well, I talk a little about what TR provided for them. One thing to think about is the Panama Canal would not have happened without TR. And that seems like kind of obvious because he pushed it, but the fact of the matter, it wasn't so much that he decided that the Panama Canal needed to be built. Remember, the French had tried to build it and been defeated. What defeated the French was yellow fever. And it was perfectly clear to people who knew about disease that the threat to the actual completion of the canal depended upon solving the yellow fever problem. And the yellow fever problem, in those days, nobody knew about mosquitoes and any of that. They thought that you got yellow fever because of sewerage kinds of things. Untrue. Well, in Cuba, there was a military doctor. I'm trying to remember his name. I can't remember now. Do you remember it? Which?
The hospital is.
No, it wasn't Walter Reed. He was there too. It was the other one. It was Gorgeous. I knew I had an audience who knows far more about this than I did. I guess he was, what, a colonel, I suppose, then. Anyway, he was a military doctor. And he knew, he discovered, he believed, he had read the latest literature on it. He knew mosquitoes were the problem. But nobody else wanted to believe it. He succeeded by cleaning up the mosquitoes, which basically means get rid of all the standing water, in eliminating yellow fever from Havana, completely eliminating it. But even that wasn't enough to convince most of the medical community and most of the military community. And so when Gorgeous was sent to Panama, nobody would support him. Nobody would do anything. And so he appealed to TR. This was typical TR, and it's about leadership. It's about how to think. TR believed in this, knew this, and forced the military to take the appropriate approaches. And they all grumbled and muttered and everything, but they did it. And yellow fever was eliminated, and as a result, the Panama Canal came into existence. I've got to hurry on. Have you still got time here?
About 1 minute.
Oh, I can't do this in 1 minute. I'll try. Let me talk about D-Day then. There were lots of other Roosevelts in the war, including my father, who landed in Torch and all sorts of things. But we've heard already about Uncle Ted, we called him in the family, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., was on D-Day. The story about it is interesting. He was sick. He'd already had several minor heart attacks, and he was sick. But he believed that we needed to have senior leadership on the beach on D-Day. And so he eventually convinced Omar Bradley, and Bradley convinced Ike that that was necessary. So Ike put out a call for any generals who would be willing to land. And there was a deafening silence. And so Uncle Ted was the only one that volunteered. So that here's this guy, he's on a cane. He's had 2 heart attacks. He can hardly move. But he is a Roosevelt, so let's let him go. So he, as we heard, he landed on Utah. He was in the first boat, probably the first soldier on the beach. and the most conspicuous one because he went in with his cane and a pistol with 6 bullets. That's all he had. And he stood on the beach all day, directing everybody and telling how the Germans didn't kill him. Who knows? It's like how the Spanish didn't kill TR when he went up San Juan Hill. They were all dismounted cavalrymen, and the only guy on a horse was TR. I mean, what kind of Spanish sharpshooter wouldn't shoot the guy on the horse? I mean, that's what you do. Anyway, so Uncle Ted was there, and as it was mentioned, his son was on Omaha, and so they were the only father-son team. Uncle Ted was the only general officer and the oldest person on the beach, and unfortunately, this basically tore him apart, and he died shortly thereafter. We're proud, again, I'm kind of bragging, but we're proud that General Patton once was asked, what was the bravest feat you ever saw? And he said it was Uncle Ted on the beach. I would choke up at that, but geez. And eventually, of course, you were told he was given the Medal of Honor, awarded, or whatever you do, received the Medal of Honor. And so and when TR got his Medal of Honor, that's the second father and son team who got the Medal of Honor. You know who the first one was? MacArthur and Arthur MacArthur. Yeah, of course you know, sir. But anyway, so, that's pretty good. That's pretty good company to be in. Now I'll shut up.
So in addition to heroics, which is clearly great leadership and heroics, what other factors were there, Admiral, that impacted the success of Normandy? And do we have those today? Do we have those same things in place today?
Yeah, I'm sure we have them in place today because, again, back to the theme I articulated earlier, I think these generations repeat themselves in American history. And we're fond of talking about the greatest generation. And I think the World War II generation was a great generation. I look at these young millennials in Iraq and Afghanistan, repetitive deployments, life-changing injuries. They're a pretty great bunch as well. And I think if we look at our flag and general officers in the Second World War and we look at the leaders that we have today, I think you do see these qualities repeat. So 3 things that I think are consistent in a leadership perspective. One is, and again, I think Susan Eisenhower hit it, it's humility. It is understanding that you can have the most beautiful plan in place and you can have the most incredible people working for you and you can have the best resources and the most powerful military, and yet factors will influence and change, and you have to have the humility to understand that you are not bulletproof, that contact with the enemy will change that plan. And I think General Eisenhower realized that. He had real humility. And I think you see that echoed today when you look at leaders like General Dunford or my Naval Academy classmate, General John Allen in Afghanistan, or many, many others. So I think humility is a very important quality in leaders. A second is creativity, the ability to kind of turn the cube and look at it in an entirely different way. And again, I think that back to Overlord, Neptune, you saw, for example, the use of deception, the creativity in taking Patton, this sort of unguided weapon, and who the Germans really focused on, and putting him in command of this mythical army across from Calais and deceiving the Germans. That's an act of real creativity. I mean, they went to the point of creating patches for each of the elements of this fictitious army, and they made that stick in extraordinary and clever ways. And then thirdly, and this is traditional military 101, it's determination. It is the ability to fight through the casualties, to fight through the naysayers, Colin Powell, optimism as a force multiplier. It's really determination that is a force multiplier. And I think you saw that in that generation of leaders in the Second World War, and I think we see that today in our leaders.
Humility, creativity, and determination. So we have those three. So with that said, we've been the dominant economic and military power for a very long time. Are we the dominant military and economic power today, and will we be in the future?
All great powers pass through cycles, and we see that again and again in human history. We are today engaged in a struggle, and you think I'm about to say China, but we are engaged and I'll come to that. We are in a struggle with Iran, and part of our problem in rationalizing our engagement with Iran is that we think of them as kind of a medium-sized power that is kind of annoying in the Middle East. The Iranians, believe me, do not see themselves that way. They see themselves as inheritors of an imperial power that 2,500 years ago dominated the world. The Persian Empire controlled 60% of the world's population 2,500 years ago. And if you look at the outline of where that empire existed, you see today modern Iran pushing in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Lebanon, in the Arabian Peninsula, on the borders of India, into Afghanistan. That empire faded, but echoes of it remain. And thus, you look at the Roman Empire, the British, we could go on and on. All imperial powers have a moment and then experience a period of decline. I think for the United States today, we are seeing less a decline of American power, less than what we see is the rise of the rest around us, which brings us to China. So the great story of the 21st century will be this relationship of the U.S. and China, Bill. And how it comes out, we don't know. We're at the beginning of it in a certain stage. And many of you will have read Graham Allison's, I think, quite exceptional book, Destined for War. Can America and China avoid the Thucydides trap? Destined for war. He does not put a question mark at the end of that. I, for one, do not think we are destined for war, but we are destined for a period of imperial competition in this 21st century. And I would argue that for the United States, as this unfolds, the greatest advantage we have, and this brings us back to D-Day, and I'll conclude with this, is that we operated at D-Day, and we operate today with a global set of partners, allies, partners, and friends, three different things. But we look at Europe and NATO. We look at non-NATO European nations like Sweden and Finland. We look at Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines. These are treaty allies of the United States. That's before we get to close friends and partners. That global network, which served us well on the beaches of Normandy, where 11 nations, a big number in those days, came with us, will serve us well going forward in this 21st century. I think that is the principal advantage and why I remain cautiously optimistic about the reach and the influence of America in the 21st century.
So in a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Roosevelt about humility, creativity, and determination and how it applies to the Roosevelt family in World War II in particular. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that the next question is coming from you, the audience. So you can think of your questions while we're asking this question.
All right. I'll just start with another personal note, because sometimes I get this, is that I'm never flattered when people ask me if I knew Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, I got asked it this evening. And since he died in 1919, I mean, I'm not flattered, but so nobody asked me that question. Well, that's an interesting point you bring up here. I think, you know, I agree with you, Admiral, of your points. They're excellent. One doesn't think of Theodore Roosevelt as being humble. But in fact, in a way, he was. It wasn't the way he presented himself and all, but he knew he didn't know everything. In fact, he spent a great deal of time digging into weeds about things, to get to know things, to learn about it. He's thought of as a guy who never stopped talking. And that is kind of a Roosevelt thing, I would say thing. But the fact was he was an excellent listener. But he was also an excellent storyteller, and so people remembered the stories that he told. But he was an excellent listener, and he believed in careful study of whatever he did. So let's talk a little about the Navy. I mean, TR, when he was in college at Harvard, he began writing his first book, which was a naval history of the War of 1812. And he worked on that through his college experience and then afterwards, and he finished it the next couple of years after that, after a lot of very careful study. And he published it. It was an eye-opener to lots of people, including the Navy. It was very well received, so well received that it was ordered in every ship's library at the time, not just the U.S., but also our adversary in 1812, the Royal Navy. That carried it as well. And it's still in print. I'm sure it's in the library here. It's still on capital ships, on Navy ships that we have. But that was all careful thought, so that by the time he got to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he already had a very deep knowledge. But what he didn't do is say, all right, I know everything now. Again, he had this sort of element of humility, and he spent a lot of time talking to all kinds of people in the Navy about whatever particular subject interested him at the time, for example, gunnery, and get really down into the weeds, and then begin to think the larger picture about what needed to be done to improve gunnery in the Navy. But he was a strategic thinker. He thought carefully, and he saw opportunities other people didn't see, and some of them were astonishingly ahead of his time. A couple of examples. There's a famous letter, which is, I don't know if it's the original copy, maybe, is on the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, that he wrote when he was Assistant Secretary of Navy, when he'd heard about Langley, a professor, I guess he was, out, or at least a guy who was trying to design an airplane out in California. This was before Kitty Hawk. And he wrote this letter to various people in the Navy saying, this is going to be important for the Navy. We need to get into the ground floor here and figure out how we can use airplanes, which hadn't even been invented yet, to extend the power. When Mahan published his famous book, TR, who had read everything immediately, had read it within a week and had met Mahan shortly thereafter, became very good friends and became, bought into that whole theory of naval power. An extraordinary thing. He always kept thinking like that. Let's talk about submarines. Submarines had been around since the Civil War, but not successfully. Most submariners didn't make it much further than the dock. So the first major effort to produce a submarine that could actually be functional and be useful was in TR's time, and he pushed it. And he wanted to kind of focus on submarines, so he ordered the first submarine, or one of the first submarines, to come up outside of his, in Long Island Sound, outside of his, where he lived, his summer White House. Oddly enough, it seemed to me like a crazy name. It was called the Plunger, which seems to be an odd name for a submarine. But anyway, so it arrived, and he wanted to go out to it. The Secret Service wouldn't let him go because it was a stormy day. So he kind of commandeered a little boat and rowed out to the submarine pretty much frightening the captain, because here he came, and demanded to not only take it down, but also drive it. And when he came out of it, he said, "This is dangerous," he said. He always believed that, you don't order anybody to do anything if you won't do it yourself. "This is dangerous," he said. So he ordered that all submariners would get combat pay, whether they were in combat or not, and they still are, aren't they? I think so.
But submarine pay.
Submarine pay, yeah, right. So he was very forward-thinking about all kinds of things. And strategically, just a quick one here, is the whole relationship with Japan. TR saw Japan, unlike most Westerners, as a very civilized, powerful, and maybe dangerous nation. And he worried, this is back in early 1900, he worried about Hawaii and Pearl Harbor with the Japanese. And his approach to this was first, because of all the rest, build up the Navy. And he built our Navy and created what he called the Great White Fleet. And he sent the Great White Fleet around the world on a peace mission. But of course, its main purpose was to show we had the power to do it. And I think that was the first world-around cruise of any full group of Navy vessels. But he didn't threaten Japan. He just showed his power and then worked them. He turned out he was a terrific diplomat. And he got that, with some very difficult issues going on at the time, he got the whole thing on an even keel. And it's kind of too bad that our governments subsequently didn't follow that lead, because of course it wound up in disaster at Pearl Harbor. So he had this strategic thinking, but to him it was based on very careful knowledge and very getting to understand things. And he thought that the military needed that kind of education. And so he created the first higher level education for the military, which was the Army War College, and had this gorgeous building built for it then. At some point you threw them out and took over, but because he wanted our officers, or officers groups, to think this way, to think strategically, and to think minusculely, and to train them, have a place to do this. And now we have this huge, best in the world military education, which takes place right in this building and all around here and many other places. And I hope that does something to your question.
So there are many that believe that he is actually the guy who came up with the idea of the six-phase campaign construct: shape, deter, seize the initiative, dominate, stabilize, enable civil authority, with global theater and campaign shaping underneath of it.
Of course.
And I would probably agree with that. Questions from the audience? Sir.
Excuse me for standing. I'm a little slow.
Yes, sir. We're fine.
Sam Leslie from the Dwight D. Eisenhower Society. Appreciate it if you'd comment a little bit on the actual margin of success of the D-Day operation being a little dicey, a little close, and maybe you could comment on what mistakes we actually did make, which you never hear about because of the overall success of the operation.
I'm not a remarkably deep historian with that kind of granular knowledge of the invasion itself, so I'll stipulate that at the beginning. But I'll give you a couple of broad observations. I think that the margin of victory was indeed small. To put the numbers on it, it was 156,000 troops attacking 50,000 Germans. So if you go to Clausewitz, offense is to defense as 3 is to 1. So you are right on that bare margin of the number of troops. Number 2, we had, I would say, not strategic surprise, but I think we achieved tactical surprise, but barely. And I think back to my earlier comment about the use of deception, again, I think that was a thin margin. And if the Germans had been able to know where we were coming ashore, I think it could have been a very different ending to the story because of the previous point I made about the relatively tight margin of attack. And in terms of how it came out as the overall campaign went, I think it was an extremely bold stroke that was enabled by that thin margin, but it was also the point I made earlier with Captain Parker, optimism is a force multiplier, and I think General Eisenhower, I always have to pause in this context and not say President Eisenhower, but General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was sufficiently confident of his troops and the situation that he was willing to put it on a very thin margin. And as I'm sure many here know, he actually wrote a press release that says, "We have failed. I take full responsibility for us," which I think makes your point, sir, that he knew it was a very close margin at the end of the day.
Any thoughts on things that we actually did wrong that we may never have heard about?
No, I don't have any particular insight to offer on that.
A win is a win.
I think a win is a win, and again, I think your very trenchantly observed question answers your second question, which is the willingness to take risk could have gone very wrong on that day, but it did not.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir.
Stanley Kober, a Fletcher alum.
Hey, nice to see you.
When Dwight Eisenhower was president, after the armistice in Korea, not a single American service member died in combat.
Right.
The other day, at a commencement ceremony at one of our military academies, Vice President Pence said, "You will see combat. Count on it." When did war become our natural condition? And are we asking too much of too few? You yourself mentioned how much smaller the Navy is now than it was years ago.
Mm-hmm. I think if you look at the long throw of American history, combat has been a reoccurring pattern in our history, as it has been in human history. So I think it's the periods of time when we had, if you will, moments of peace are relatively few in our history and relatively few in universal history. But let me give you some good news. And here I'd recommend a book by Steven Pinker, Our Better Angels, which looks at, in very analytic and metric terms, at the reduction in the propensity of human societies to go to war. Now, to the question specifically of Eisenhower, and I think it is an interesting one, he was someone who knew war intimately through not only World War II, which we're discussing tonight, but really through his experiences throughout his career. And he was determined to avoid that. Yet, back to the question asked earlier, he was willing to take risk, and he took risk in many circumstances not engaging U.S. troops. In particular, I'd commend Evan Thomas's book, Eisenhower's Bluff, about the way that Ike was able to effectively play bridge with his opponents with nuclear weapons. And he was capable of doing that, I think, because of his extraordinary life and career and the gravitas that he brought to the office. It seems unlikely to me that a current president would have that kind of gravitas to bring to the equation. So to conclude, I would say, yes, we are a nation that has been engaged in many wars in its history. Many of them have been tragic misadventures, no question. On the other hand, I think the long trend is a reduction in the enthusiasm with which we throw ourselves into wars. And I would argue coming out of this period with Iraq and Afghanistan, hopefully increasingly in the rearview mirror, I think there will be less of a tendency to leap forward into war. The period that I would compare it to is not actually Eisenhower's, although you're correct to surface that, it's the post-Vietnam era. If you look at the U.S. coming out of Vietnam in 1975, we really don't go into significant combat again until the Persian Gulf War. That, I think, is more the anomaly than the reality.
But I'd like to add a point, which is very interesting. TR is considered as very bellicose. He's even been called a warmonger, all sorts of things. And yet his presidency was the only one in the 20th century where no U.S. soldier fired a shot at anybody. And that's worth thinking about, because how did this man, who was so military-oriented and everybody thought he was, manage to lead us through a very difficult time where there are lots of opportunities for us to get into war? How did he manage to not do it? And to keep us out of war, so to speak. And that's something worth thinking about, and it had a lot to do with his approach. About, you know, everybody thought he would go to war at the drop of a hat, so nobody wanted to start a war. But it's much more complicated than that. It has to do with diplomacy and how he used diplomacy and how his people used diplomacy. After all, he settled the Russo-Japanese War, which was looking like it was going to turn into the First World War, through pretty much for the most part, his brilliant diplomacy. So it's an interesting thing to think about. What everybody thinks is our most bellicose president was indeed not.
And if I could just add, because some in the audience may not know that, and I think Roosevelt will go down permanently in history. He's retired this record. He is a recipient of the Medal of Honor for combat and won the Nobel Peace Prize for the diplomatic engagement of ending the Russo-Japanese War. I would dare say nobody in American history is going to hit those two marks again.
And not only that, both of them are in the Roosevelt room in the White House, one of which the Roosevelt people put there, the idea that it represents what America stands for, both sides.
Yeah, and we should remember our founding president, George Washington, is often referred to as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. I would argue and agree with you, Tweed, that I think Roosevelt carries that tradition forward.
So we're going to go back to the audience with questions, but before we do, Admiral, we look back at World War II and the post-Normandy. We've now been successful as a nation and with our allies. And one of the things we were successful at was ensuring that the Russians didn't get too much of a foothold and overrun Germany. Where are we at today?
Well, this gets us to NATO, and you know, famously, the first Secretary General of NATO said in shorthand that NATO exists to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. So if you take that as a pretty simple shorthand, I think NATO still fulfills kind of those three, although I'm going to shade the center one. I think NATO continues to keep America in, despite a little creaking in the transatlantic bridge from our current president. At the end of the day, President Trump, who has been somewhat negative about NATO from time to time, I am confident understands the value of keeping the United States engaged. I think we continue to deter Russia from adventurism in Estonia, in NATO countries. Russia is willing to roll into Ukraine, into Moldova, into Georgia. Russia will not cross a NATO border in anger. I am convinced of that. So we fulfill that. In terms of Germany, keeping Germany down, that's really shorthand for avoiding further intra-European conflicts. In many ways, the greatest achievement in NATO is probably not that no nation has attacked NATO. The greatest achievement is that no NATO nation has attacked another NATO nation. After 2,000 years of Europeans attacking each other, NATO has kind of kept the peace on that continent. So I think we're actually in pretty good shape. We ought to nourish that. We ought to be mindful of the fact that if we look at history, and we go back 100 years ago, Bill, to the end of the First World War, someone needs to turn that off or I'm going to have to leave. If we go back 100 years ago, at the end of the First World War, what did the United States do? We walked away from Europe, we pulled all of our troops out, we came home, we rejected the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations. We erected massive tariff barriers, the Hawley-Smoot tariffs. We decided that we can bring it all home and do it all here in America. How'd that work out? Well, we broke the global economy. You can drop a plumb line to the Great Depression and another plumb line to the rise of fascism. It's fashionable today to be worried about authoritarian regimes. Let's look back 100 years ago at the rise of National Socialism, Mussolini in Italy. We've seen a lot worse. Point being, what we ought to learn from that experience 100 years ago is that American engagement, America in, keep Europe calm, Germans down. Europe calm, keep the Russians out. That's the right prescription to move forward. I think we've still got that. We need to be mindful that it doesn't drift away from us.
So somebody was phoning in with a question over here. Other questions? Sir.
Sorry
Dueling questions. We'll come back to you. Go ahead, Jim.
Sorry about the phone. It wasn't my wife, for a change.
It's okay.
My name is Jim Murphy. I'm a 1991 graduate here. I am delighted to be back for one particular reason. My father was wounded on D-Day. My father was a combat glider pilot. He flew a big British Horsa glider in his stick of 5 gliders behind San Mary-Glise. His power ship got hit on the way in, so they cut him loose early. And he made it in the landing zone Oscar. He carried 16 82nd Airborne artillerymen, 105 ammo, and a Jeep. My father crashed into the hedgerow, which are really rock walls built by French farmers by clearing their fields every spring with shrubbery on the top. 80% casualty rate in the 5 gliders that went in. 4 killed, 4 wounded, including my father, 2 unscathed. That's pretty amazing. So, but he lived to be 96. He's buried in Section 60, right smack in the middle of Section 60 at Arlington. I visited him today. Looks pretty good. For his age, he'd be 102 right now.
He's in good company there with another great generation.
Indeed he is. Indeed he is, all around him. My question has to do, I spent 46 years in the intelligence business, so I try to think ahead. I'm often wrong. Tell me what warfare, non-nuclear warfare, might look like in 2025 when we are faced with a regional problem precipitated by 2 major world powers, both the Chinese and the Russians, who are feeling their oats once again, even though they're a dying nation in so many ways. What will warfare look like, especially given the fact that 5G is about ready to take over our computers and our cell phones in the very near future?
First of all, I think you're right to point out the Russia-China confluence. We ought to be mindful of the way Russia and China are drawing closer together. We shouldn't overreact to it. And I often say, for Vladimir Putin, he's playing with fire in terms of bringing Russia closer with China as follows. Russia, as you allude to, is a nation in decline. Its population is rapidly declining, and it's also maldistributed. Almost all Russians live to the west of the Ural Mountains. To the east, a vast land area the size of the United States of America is essentially empty. 14 million people live there. Fewer than live in Manhattan and surrounding New York area. And yet it is full of timber, water, gold, rare earths, hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas. China looks at that like my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really good. So Putin is playing with fire, but he's going to play that card because he believes that is the best path to keep Russia relevant going forward. So I agree with your proposition that we're going to see increased Russian and Chinese cooperation, condominium, to use a 19th century word, in global affairs. To answer the question, what will war look like? I think you're correct also to underline a conventional war. I think we can avoid a nuclear war. But I would say instead of this traditional strategic triad we think about, I would postulate a new triad, and that will be unmanned vehicles, so space, undersea, surface, drones as we categorize them, unmanned. Second will be cyber security driven by machine learning, which is what leads to artificial intelligence. And third will be special forces, extremely elite, potentially biologically enhanced individuals who are therefore additive in those three zones. Again, my prerogative as a naval officer, I believe that the maritime dimension will continue to be vital because it produces the ability to move forces under and on the sea throughout the globe, 70% of the world. So I think a 2025 conflict, and God help us if we get into it, but if it exists, it'll be in the South China Sea, it'll be maritime, it will have a significant cyber component to it, a significant unmanned component to it, and I believe there will be a significant special forces component. It'll play out, I hope, if it has to, in that zone. If it expands, it will expand into the Indian Ocean and into Northeast Asia, into the East China Sea. We need to avoid that because down that path is where nuclear engagement lies.
Sir.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get a twofer in since I stood up without realizing that my friend back here was trying to ask a question. So, Dr. Roosevelt, I wondered if you could talk to us a little about what the national will was like during FDR's administration. It seems that pre-December 1941, it was very anti-interventionalist, and then probably peaking around just after D-Day as far as the national will goes. And then, Admiral, if you'd compare and contrast how that national will looks today.
Sure. No, that's a good question.
Yeah, very good question. Of course, we were very isolationist before Pearl Harbor. Most of Americans didn't want to do it again, didn't want to have anything to do it, just had their kind of heads in the sand. Many didn't, but many did. One thing's worth remembering is that FDR's view was very different, but he was tied by public opinion and you know, just the general politics of the day. It's interesting because FDR modeled his career on TR. And so one of the things he did was he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just as TR was. And he had great interest in the Navy, and he was a sailor, and that was, I think, an experience that he found very useful. But it played out in the Second World War, particularly because of Winston Churchill's interest in the Navy. And so they were both very much focused on naval issues, and this was a bond between them, a bond to such a point where TR would address his letters, the private letters, to Winston Churchill as a naval person. So you had FDR, who was aware that the situation was extremely dangerous and that the longer we waited, the more difficult it was going to be and that we would inevitably have to get into it. And so how could all this be managed? And I don't know what would have happened if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened. I mean, that's an interesting thing to speculate. But he already had a very strong bond with Winston Churchill. And of course, we had considered ourselves as having a very special relationship with England. I suppose, I'd be interested in what you think, but I suppose we would have gotten in anyway, but I don't know how.
To pick up your point, I think it's unclear if we would have gotten in absent the Japanese attack. I think you correctly described extreme countervailing forces in the country. Pearl Harbor changed all that. It's a good example of how a given moment can suddenly change everything. And I'm not a fan of alternate histories, but if you want to really scare yourself, either read the novel by Philip Dick or watch the television show Man in the High Castle and think about consequences. In terms of today, you know, I think if the United States were a dog, it would be a golden retriever. It would be kind of bounding through the world, its tail knocking things around, basically a happy dog that is unmindful about its larger environment. When then something bad happens, that dog can very quickly turn into a German Shepherd, a pit bull. Other nations need to be mindful of that, I think. I would say our national will today is roughly along those lines. We'd like to keep bounding along, and yet if something deeply, truly touches our national interest, we will become that German Shepherd, that pit bull. That's 9/11. That's what happened. And are we capable of that again? Yeah, we really are. Other nations would be wise to mind that. On the other hand, we would be wise to ensure that we don't unnecessarily conduct that transformation.
Another example, by the way, was the Maine. Turned it completely around overnight.
It did. And can I pick up on that point? Sure. And then I know we need to conclude. But everywhere I've gone in my career in the Navy, I've had a picture on the wall of the USS Maine. It's a beautiful painting that I've had for decades. And you will all know that on February 15th, 1898, the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. And as Tweed correctly says, that was the catalyst that launched us into the Spanish-American War. You'll remember the slogan, "Remember the Maine." Hearst journalism drove us into that war, which made Teddy Roosevelt's career in some ways. People ask me, well, you know, Stavridis, there are a lot of ships in the Navy. Why do you keep a picture of the Maine on your wall, which blew up and sank? Why don't you have a picture of the Enterprise, the carrier strike group that you led, or a picture of the Berry, your first command? And the answer is, I keep a picture of the Maine on my wall because of that story. Ship blows up. We know that Spanish terrorists blew up the Maine, and thus we launch into the Spanish-American War. Except that 50 years later, when we actually salvage the Maine, we discover with almost certainty, there's a slight bit of ambiguity, but almost certainly, that the Maine blew up because of an internal event, either a boiler explosion or an ammunition explosion. Hyman Rickover conducted, by the way, that salvage. Wonder whatever happened to him. Here's the point. The reason I keep a picture of the Maine on the wall in my office, and it's on my office today, is for two reasons. One is have a plan B, because your ship can blow up under your feet at any moment. Have a plan B. Life will throw those curves at you. 9/11, the Maine, Pearl Harbor. Point two, before you rush to judgment, before you launch a war because you know that, in this case, Spanish terrorists blew up the Maine, review the fact pattern. Take your time. Don't make decisions in haste that will change everything. Those are pretty good lessons for a life. That's why I hang the USS Maine on the wall in my office. And it's interesting to know that connection to Teddy Roosevelt today.
Ladies and gentlemen, your thirst of knowledge may only be overtaken by your desire for dessert, which is going to be outside in just a moment. Please join me in thanking our two panelists with a great conversation this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great job.
And these are the type of events that we do at the National Defense University and the Foundation. We do them on a regular basis. We have the American Patriot Award coming up. We have lots of other events coming up, and we hope that you will continue to join us and support us helping the National Defense University. Again, thank you very much for being here tonight, and please join us for some dessert and coffee outside. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Well done, sir.
Well done to you.